Okay, so I promise you brief closing remarks, and I will keep these brief. Beforehand, there is some housekeeping because there is always housekeeping. So, can I just ask those of you who are not returning tomorrow if you could please leave your lanyards at the check-in desk? That would be great, thank you. If you are joining us for the evening reception, make sure that you have collected your wristband at the reception desk as well. This is a festival after all, so we must have wristbands. And I think there are a few wristbands left as well. So if you are at a loose end for the next couple of hours, please do feel free to join us. So as we come to the end of the first day of the National Open Research Festival, I just want to take a few moments to thank those who made today possible, to reflect on what we've heard, and to look ahead to what's next for open research in Ireland. First, I want to extend sincere thanks to everyone who contributed to today's programme, to our speakers, our chairs, our panellists, and our workshop coordinators, many of whom travelled to be here. Thank you for your insights, your openness, and your generosity in sharing your expertise. A special thanks, I hope you'll all agree, is owed to Joy Owongo, who travelled from Kenya to attend the festival and to give her inspirational and motivational keynote address and contributed so much to today's programme. If you just join me in thanking Joy once more, please. Thank you so much. To the very patient members of our programme committee, so Ailish O'Carroll, Open Research Support Officer at NORF, Beth Kazook, Research Data Manager at DRI, Alexandra Della Palta, Director of RDA Europe, Edie Davis, Programme Officer of Research Policy at Research Ireland, Joan Murphy, Daria IE National Manager, Sinead Reardon, Head of International Relation and Policies at the Royal Irish Academy, Claire Dillon, Co-Founder of Open Ireland Network, and Jenny O'Neill, Research Engagement Officer at HEANet. Thank you for working so thoughtfully to shape today's agenda. Thank you to the Royal Irish Academy for once again hosting us in this truly beautiful venue, and thank you to my wonderful colleagues at the Digital Repository of Ireland. Thank you to the Department of Further and Higher Education, Research, Innovation and Science, and to the Higher Education Authority for funding the event and for your continued leadership. And finally, a word of appreciation for the volunteers and staff who have worked quietly behind the scenes, managing logistics, registration, microphones, timing, and putting out little fires I'm sure I'm not aware of. It is that invisible and meticulous work that events like this rely on, and I'm truly very grateful. So in that regard, I'd like to thank Ellie Cullen, who is hiding down the back of the room, NORF's Communications and Engagement Officer, who for the second year running stepped in at the 11th hour and transformed the programme into a vibrant and engaging event. And I'd also like to make special mention of Ailish O'Carroll, who unfortunately couldn't join us today as she's on maternity leave. Ailish has been an absolute pleasure to work with, and I wish her every happiness and joy in this new chapter of her life. So while we're closing today's formal sessions, the festival is not over. Day 2 will feature a series of community engagement workshops exploring the next phase of open research monitoring in Ireland, the future of open research and public engagement, open science and public-private partnerships, and aligning our national PID strategy with EOSC recommendations. Listening to today's discussions, several themes have emerged. First, the interconnectedness of global open science and the importance of visibility of research outputs. We explored the role of infrastructure and interoperability and heard of the shared commitment to ensure Ireland's systems are connected, sustainable and internationally aligned. Many of these conversations emphasised what we already know, that persistent identifiers are a foundational infrastructure to enable open science. We highlighted how open science is future-proofing our research and innovation ecosystem. We heard about the importance of moving from policy to practice and implementation. And many of the NORF-funded projects and affiliates not only discussed how they were indeed moving from policy to practice, but did just that via the Open Research 101 workshops. We discussed the central issue of research culture, how we recognise and reward open practices, and how we ensure that openness is inclusive, equitable, and embedded in how research is valued. Across all these discussions, we heard about the importance of community, supporting and conducting research for community, by community, and with community. So it has been almost 3 years since NORF launched the National Action Plan for Open Research, and during that time we've made significant progress in coordination, infrastructure, and capacity building. We've built partnerships across government, higher education, and civil society, and we've strengthened Ireland's voice in international conversations about openness and equity in research. As many of you will know, this is a moment of transition for NORF. The forum's activities at the Academy are drawing to a close at the end of this year, marking the completion of an important chapter in its development. And I want to take this opportunity to acknowledge the role of both the Royal Irish Academy and the Digital Repository of Ireland in hosting and supporting NORF, and to thank all of the colleagues here who have contributed so much to its success. While the next phase of NORF's work will take shape in a new context, the community and shared purpose that have grown around it will continue to thrive. And I hope that you are all greatly encouraged by William Bosang's remarks this morning, reaffirming the department's commitment to the open research agenda and highlighting the impacts of the NORF-funded projects to date. And to those NORF projects that will be ongoing throughout 2026, I want to assure you now that you have absolutely nothing to worry about, and we will discuss the administration of the funding in further detail tomorrow. The next phase of our work will ask us to look forward. The geopolitics, geoeconomics, and technology shaping research are evolving rapidly. Artificial intelligence, data governance, and new models of scholarly communication are shaping how we create and share knowledge. Our challenge is to ensure that Ireland not only keeps pace with these changes, but is a leading voice, guided by the values of openness, autonomy, collaboration, integrity, inclusivity, care and collegiality, and excellence. That leadership will depend on all of us and on continued investment, not only in systems and infrastructures, but in people. To quote Joy's keynote, we need strong communities to amplify collective action. Communities are at the heart of this transformation. Open research requires open communities, and open communities require care, recognition, and resources. So, as I reflect not only on today, but on the last 3 years, what stands out most to me is this community. Open research in Ireland is thriving because of the people who are building it: researchers, librarians, data experts, technologists, funders, and policymakers working together with a shared purpose. And I want to sincerely thank each of you for giving me the opportunity to work with you and for you over the last 3 years. So, as we close the first day of the National Open Research Festival, I want to congratulate each of you on all of your work to date and to encourage you to keep fighting the good fight. I hope to continue the conversation with some of you at this evening's reception and to come back tomorrow ready to roll up our sleeves and dive into the workshops. Together we are building on an open, inclusive and world-class research system for Ireland, one that benefits not just our research community, but the whole of society. Thank you all and enjoy the rest of your evening.
Hello everyone, I am delighted to be here to welcome our final set of panellists for the day to the stage to talk about the important topic of open research for innovation. So if I can ask the panellists to just join me on stage, I will, thank you. I will start by giving a brief personal introduction. My name is Claire Dillon. I'm a PhD researcher with the University of Galway and Lero. I'm also community lead for an organisation called Curious, which is the Community for University and Research Institution Open Source Programme Offices, enabling open source in universities. But my hat for today is a co-founder with Open Ireland Network, which is a social enterprise that is responsible for promoting the open source as a vehicle for innovation and collaboration between public sector, academia, government and corporates for innovation. And so I'm delighted to be here to host this particular panel. And I would like to welcome some familiar faces from earlier today. So you will all be familiar with Joy Owango, who's the founding director of TCC Africa, and indeed Latoro Matas, who is with La Referencia. And perhaps you may also be familiar with our two other panelists, but new to the stage today, are Kalpana Shankar, who is the Professor of Research and Policy and Practice and the PI of the Roach Project, which is the review of open research in connected health, and indeed Aideen Culham, who is the Professor for Cancer Genomics and Director of the Limerick Digital Cancer Research Centre. So I am going to start today's panel by asking each of our panelists, I suppose, assuming that most people here today would be familiar and support the idea that open research promotes innovation, but noting, as one of my panelists did earlier, that not everyone does believe in that idea, can you perhaps share your own perspective about how open research relates to innovation? Joy, will we start with you?
I look at it from the context where it is the skeleton to creating innovation. But the mere fact we talk about open research for innovation or into innovation does not necessarily mean that you have communities that understand how to first of all access the open research and how to use it effectively to create innovation. So a better way of rephrasing it would be back to what I had said earlier on looking at it from the context of access to agency. So there's a need, the need to make sure that our work is more representative and creating technologies that could actually support that entire ecosystem. But for that to be effective, we need capacity building. Otherwise, we will be talking till the cows come home. It's a very common saying in Africa because you take the cows at 6, bring them back at 6. Till the cows come home, and you'll still not be able to take advantage of open research and all that it has for any kind of innovation. Yeah.
Thank you. And if I can move on to Kalpana.
Thanks for that introduction, Claire. As Claire mentioned, I'm a principal investigator of the Roach Project, where we're in effect studying public-private research partnerships and open science. We have a lot of those in Ireland, and to scope the project, we're particularly focusing on digital health, where Ireland has a lot of ambitions. And poor Claire, like, she puts up this lovely document, says, I know everyone in the room is going to agree that innovation, can be supported by open science. I'm like, not so fast. I'm not so sure about this. And we've done a number of interviews with researchers, research support staff, technology transfer officers, VPs of research, and we've just started doing some interviews with private sector spin-outs and startups that came from university collaborations and still collaborate with universities. We've also been doing interviews we're both here in Ireland, and we have a colleague in Denmark who had been supporting our project because, and I can talk about this later. I'm not so sure. I think here in Ireland, we're really well behind the curve because a lot of the people we've talked to, and not just the researchers themselves, the concern about intellectual property, making work open at the, quote, wrong, end quote, time, it's almost like open science was considered a barrier to research. And in fact, most of the technology transfer officers we talked to did not know what open science was. They didn't want to talk to us because, like, I don't know what open science is. And we're like, okay, that's data, so talk to us. So I am maybe more skeptical, so I don't know how I got invited on this panel about this. Well, you know, we can talk about that. And there may be exemplars, other countries that are, I would say, much further ahead on this.
Skeptics keep the panel interesting, so thank you, Kalpana. Okay, Aideen, so barrier, enabler, what is open research in relation to innovation for you?
So I suppose to give a little bit of context, I'm head of Elixir Ireland, which is a pan-European organisation of over 20 countries about life science data. And when we talk about life science data, we're generally talking about really big files that aren't part of the publication, but are part of repositories. And up until recently, the Irish solution to making these data public was largely to submit them to the repositories in Cambridge in the UK or to American repositories. But increasingly, we're recognizing that, you know, genomics data, genetics data, and life science data, you know, there's a data sovereignty requirement there. But we lack the infrastructure in Ireland to actually share. We have no national repository for life science data. We have data management plans, but we don't have any place to put the data. And so these are really, really big gaps. To have these resources, we need a compute infrastructure. At the moment, our national compute infrastructure is in Luxembourg. To have a compute infrastructure, we need an academic data center. But we actually don't have a data center in a university that can actually take GPUs. So we have a really big infrastructure gap that we need if we want to make data open. Now, as on the governance board of Bioconductor, we have written some of the software that is most highly cited in the world. Chan Zuckerberg did a study of essential open source software, essential open science software in all of the literature. It was a very, very big study looking over the past 10 years of every piece of software that's been written and how widely it's cited. Of the top 10 software in our organization was in the top 7 of the top 10. So we know how to do this. We just need the tools, I think, and until we actually have that full infrastructure in Ireland, we probably will have gaps in people's understanding of the value of open science.
Thanks, Aideen. And I suppose moving from that, well, both global but also Irish focus, maybe we can also hear about the global kind of perception of this idea of open research and innovation and the link between them, and perhaps, as Aideen pointed to, the requirements that are there to make that ecosystem happen. Yep.
It's working?
It is, okay. We can hear you great.
That's okay. So from the perspective of regional network, our main mission is to give visibility and access, open access, to all the research results of our community, especially the public funded ones. And for us, this is it's a good source, not the only one possible source for innovation. Remember that the innovation is not only about science and science results, but it could be a good source. So we work and we develop infrastructures to make this available for the citizens that paid for that research. And then the citizens, the startups, the entrepreneurs are included. The people that can use this as a source for innovation. But I must say that I'm shocked, because I was going to talk about the barriers. And one of the barriers is the money and how much we are spending in the bad route to open access, which is, I'm shocked by Dawn. The presentation, I don't know why the people is not screaming and complaining, because it's obscene. For me, seeing that amount for one single institution, that amount of money, let me say that we as a regional network, our budget, annual budget, is less than half that. So we do everything we do with just less than a half that much. So imagine what you can do with that money, like more research, more even creating infrastructures to solve that problem. So it's urgent to design a plan to not to invest more, because when you see the amount of EPC, what you're paying is profit. Take a look to those companies and the results. They are making billions. So what you're paying is not for published, it's in the pockets of that people. And it's public funding going from your pockets to their pockets. So that's what we need to do if we want a more dynamic scientific and innovation system. Invest that money in other places.
Thank you, Lautaro. And I think we'll come back around because we've started this discussion now about both barriers and enablers, maybe at a system level. Perhaps we can actually continue that around. Joy, maybe you talked a little bit more about what you see as being other key enablers or even lessons learned from people who have already, even with limited infrastructure, taken that journey from open research to innovation.
Okay. In Africa, what has happened, first of all, when you're looking, before we go to Africa, when you look at the Global South and the representation on the investment on open research and innovation, we shouldn't lump South America and Africa in that system, because South America historically has had a communist socialistic system, so everything is for social good. So it's easier for them, it's actually much easier for them to have started in investing in education because it is for social good. As compared to Africa, where we come from, the bulk of our countries are capitalistic in nature. It's until 2016 we had governments creating granting councils whose objective was to just invest in higher education and research. We never had that. So funding was being thrown left, right, and center when it came to higher education. So what is the impact on open research and innovation in regards to that? Number one, funders are now questioning a clear return on investment because now they're being monitored on where they're investing in research. So they want to see that research. As I earlier said, the fact that we have members of parliament talking about rankings in universities, so they're demanding on the visibility of research. What about innovation? They are cognizant. So these are enablers. The fact that in Africa now we have granting councils, that is an enabler. And out of that, there's a demand for easy access to research. So they want to see how do we make research open. And the fact that they're cognizant that infrastructure in higher education is expensive, they're looking at how they can also support the NRENs, so the regional NRENs. So these regional networks are instrumental in aiding conversations on open research into innovation. But the fact that we have supranational organizations coming up with research discovery databases, we're having continental preprint repositories with our project, the Africa PID Alliance. This is all stemmed on the fact that we are seeing a change in the political dynamics within the government, and there's a demand for us to contribute to the visibility of our output, such that we are able to change the narrative. So again, the 400,000, that for one institution, that is really, really a lot. And that is what we would be given to run maybe multi-year projects. And of course, these are stark differences, but the reality is that most of these innovations that we are creating are coming out of necessity. That's the demand of access to agencies is so high, so it's coming out of necessity, and we are working with worst case scenario when we have no resources at all to see how best that can also be replicated by other institutions and governments as well.
Kalpana, would you like to add to that in terms of other enablers?
Sure. I think Joy brings up an interesting point, is that a lot of open science has been somewhat extractive of the global south. You know, that those of us in the north have had the resources, the infrastructure, good or bad, I mean, something, And what we have been doing over time is extracting knowledge from Africa and elsewhere. And you know, the sort of shibboleth that we all kind of ascribe to is that open science is some kind of equalizer, democratization, but we're finding that local context matters so much, and it's not. And so I want us to be, maybe that's not necessarily directly tied to innovation per se, but we also need to question what innovation means. I admit when I got this invitation, at first it was like innovation, oh, okay, because I'm working on this project looking at so-called innovation, commercialization. But Joy points to an entirely different kind of innovation. And that, to date, is not what our open science really has been supporting. Jenny talked about EOSC and so forth, and for years I've questioned, like I was wondering, where is the public sector in EOSC? Where's the public sector in the open science? A lot of this has been companies and consultants and so forth, where, especially in Europe, where we're giving money, public sector money, as you pointed out, to private companies to make our own work open that the taxpayers are paying for. The big publishers have jumped on this. The journalist Jeffrey Monbiot, mentioned that these companies are making 35 to 40% profit year on year. The only industry where you can do better is drug dealing, and even then, now with decriminalization, man, I'm not so sure. So, I think this is one of my concerns in terms of a barrier to true open research.
Thank you. And I suppose we have started the conversation now about the idea of I suppose, bridging between academia and public sector and indeed the corporate actors in this game. I think it was mentioned earlier as well that, a lot of the innovation agenda in Ireland is also being directed to, I suppose, work with some of our corporate actors in the Irish ecosystem, both Indigenous players and global actors as well. And indeed, despite the fact that some of those may be reaping great profits from the open access or lack of system, the idea of open research can also be a way in which collaboration can happen in a good way between public sector and academia and corporate actors. Can you maybe talk to that being an opportunity in terms of, is there a potential there for open research to be a kind of an enabler of innovation, of cross-sectoral innovation in that way? Please, yes, sorry, Aideen. Yeah.
I'll just comment
please,
on,
yes.
so one of the things that we've done within Bioconductor, we founded a community advisory board that's global. We have every continent, so it's a disaster when we're planning the monthly meeting. We've got rotating time zones. But when we reached out to our community, we realized training was a really big need. But rather than us going to Africa doing training, we've set up a Train the Trainer program. And we've now trained like 40 instructors globally who are then doing courses. And recognizing we had a gap in training in Africa and courses in Africa, what we're doing is we have funding and we're actually running courses in Africa, but with the local trainers that are trained to enable them to get their first start on their first course. And we bring in 3 other instructors from Africa in every single course. Thereafter, they're doing their own courses. So we've actually set up a whole Train the Trainer program to enable local people. And then we've also done translation. So we have like Belgian, Canadian, and Nigerian French speakers all working together to come up with a unified French, and a lot of that is using AI. And then what we'll do is we'll use the local dialects as well. And so there's a whole thing we're now doing in multiple languages, and we've got like this systemic carpentries program that we're running globally. But that seems to be actually building local capacity, which is really what we wanted to do. Innovation, sorry, and private public. I think within life sciences and health, there's going to be an enormous transformation over the next few years because of the AI continent and the data spaces. So this is the big new European program. And the first of these data spaces is going to be the EHDS, the European Health Data Space. And this is something that we're definitely preparing for. And with this, all health data will be made available for secondary research And this is an enormous undertaking. So how do you make this data available for research, but also securely? And so there's a lot of work that we're doing within Elixir on how you actually create secure data environments. And I think increasingly we're going to see that we have open science, but that open science is, you know, protected on you having the authenticated access to be able to access those data points. Because we can't just make the national health data available without protections. But like, the thing that's critical to that is developing then a common language and a common data model and a common data standard. And it's working. Like, there's now a project running out of Oxford, Darwin EU, that has 180 million European health records mapped to this common data model. And this is what we're doing within the Health Hub for Cancer, is trying to connect health data on the island of Ireland. So we can run those research studies, and all of the software we're creating is open source. So it is, you know, going to enable, I think, incredible innovation, and we're also get incredible data insights on what is driving disease, comorbidities, and adverse effects to drugs, which of course then brings in the pharma, because they're mostly interested in what are the long-term outcomes and the long-term adverse effects associated with drugs. So it isn't intrinsically a public-private partnership, but there's going to be a lot of changes coming.
And can I build on that actually, 18, just before we leave, because you were speaking to Joy about this idea of working with folks, you know, local people who, rather than this idea of just relying on infrastructure or programs or data models, and that human infrastructure and those human connections are so important. And Joy's points earlier about co-creating, making that an inclusive process rather than delivering something and hoping everyone uses it. Can you speak to, in that public-private scenario, and 18, we will just start just with the health thing, and then we'll come to that global perspective. But how do we make those human connections, where people may have a data model for a common language, but academics, corporate actors, how do we get them talking to each other across different time zones, but how do we get them talking to each other?
I think it's dependent on who you're trying to reach and why. You know, if we're trying to reach patients, you reach them where they're at. It's our job to come out to them. If we're trying to reach, you have to work out what are they going to get out of it, and then why are you involving the people? I think you have to think carefully about that. I think you will always have intrinsic national interests. We were at an OMOP model, and like the FinData are doing a phenomenal job actually on how to set up a governance model that's inclusive across all the different sites, but also is enabled for secure AI. I think there's a lot we could learn there. But one of this is just funny. One of the terms that they had added to the OMOP model was childbirth in a sauna. And so, that is so Finnish. It's like, okay, so there will be intrinsic things to each country. And so working at the level, like getting down into the mud to understand what are the needs is absolutely important.
Brilliant, thank you. And I'll ask Latura to actually comment on that as well, and then we'll come back to Kalpana, who I know wants to get in.
Okay, answer your questions about the public relation with public-private, because I want to make a clarification. There is a difference between the transfer of money from the public sector to these editorials. That's different from if the research resource could be used for companies, entrepreneurs, startups to create services, products, and value. That's a good cycle. That's what we want, because we are creating value. We are not transferring money from one sector to another. There are private sector is creating value on top of the investment that the public sector did. So that's that we want. The other thing is different.
Yes.
Okay, so just to make the difference. And how to do that, when I lived in Argentina, I was working with the Ministry of a province, and we developed a program to link small companies and industries with the public sector. This was funded by that ministry, and the program was, there were people, engineers, going to the small companies and make like an assessment of the processes and bringing results from the transfer offices in the universities and trying to join the offer with the demand, even trying to solve problems that they don't even know that some solution could exist from the academic sector. And that program was very successful, and that created a lot of innovations on top of the public sector, the universities, research and results. So there's a way, but of course you need people that speaks both languages, the languages of the companies, of the private sector, and sometimes the academic sector is not, they don't understand with the private sector. So that's an example.
Thank you, Lautaro. And yes, Joy, would you like to? It's actually Kalpana. Well, either or. Joy, go right ahead.
This is about the private-public partnership and innovation and open research. Let's be honest. This conversation actually makes sense when there's a pandemic, when you're like, oh, we really need to work with private sector. My point is we shouldn't wait for a pandemic for us to critically look at how we can work with the private sector. Or in the case of Africa, we shouldn't wait for famine. You know, so all of a sudden we say, okay, let's invest in agriculture. Because when we have these conversations, practical conversations on how do we take advantage of open research into innovation in private-public partnerships, two things tend to come to fore: health and agriculture. This needs to be part of the everyday systems. And as much as we've had amazing innovations that have come out of it, like in the case of Africa during COVID-19, those genomic data enabled, which helped enable rapid vaccine development, especially in South Africa, which was still even questioned, despite the fact that we were able to be very quick in coming up with those vaccines. And Sheikh Anta Diop University in Senegal came up with a rapid test kit for COVID-19, which was going for $10. At that point, the tests were going for $100 or more. Again, was questioned, and yet that included private-public partnerships together with the Louis Pasteur Institute. So as much as we are talking about not waiting for a pandemic to happen or a famine to take place, we are still struggling on our side to legitimize our innovations, even if we are involved, we use open research. So the conversation really should be, number one, how do we stop finding ourselves legitimizing open research and innovation that comes out of the Global South as its contribution to innovation? That is number one. And also, how do we make this as an everyday system such that we don't have to wait for the next big bad thing to happen for us to have the conversation on how do we work with private sector, yet we have access to open research. Yeah.
Thank you, Joy. And now, Kalpana, through your research, you talked about some of the challenges, but are there any shining bright lights of where it works in terms of?
So one of the, as I mentioned, we did some comparator work. Finland has actually really developed a good roadmap that we hope to adopt for the Irish context as one of the outputs for the project. And Denmark is an interesting case. We did some interviews there. And somebody who talked to said, actually, open research helped them identify which labs were working on, this is on the private sector side, said, help them identify which labs were working on, things that they needed because the publications were open. Who might have PhD students or postdocs, early career researchers that they should be recruiting for jobs. So we're like, oh, that's really an interesting use. When we asked people in Ireland about this, they're like, it's same population size, roughly. oh, we already know who's working on it. We don't need open science, you know, because we do things here differently. So I think that was kind of a telling thing. And again, I mentioned Denmark. They had something called the, what is it? Open Danish Innovation Network, ODIN. And it started about 5 years ago with Aarhus University, now has expanded to a number of others, funded by the Novo Nordisk Foundation, and that's important to the story. And what they do is they set up partnerships between academic researchers and private sector spin-outs and startups who might want to collaborate. The kicker is you can't have any closed IP. Everything has to be made open. And when we asked somebody at the foundation about this, was like, well, what if something becomes interesting, commercializable? And they said, well, they have to pull out of this Odin network. And now the reason I mention it's Novo Nordisk Foundation because so much Danish science policy is actually driven by foundations. Novo Nordisk, Lego, Velux, Carlsberg. They're the ones calling the shots. So they can do what they want to do because they're basically trying to tax avoidance. Where did that come up earlier today? So they're shoveling that money towards their foundations. So we have a very different structure here with respect to science and research in general. But that's one example of how open science can work.
Thank you. And so we're coming to the end of this panel session. So I'm going to ask you all one final question, and it's, I suppose, aside from taking to the streets in protest of the wasted money that might be going around, we will do that anyway, but we'll put that on the list. But apart from that, can I ask you what one actionable thing you would put to Ireland in terms of what they can do to help open research, I suppose, enable this innovation ecosystem? So specifically that we could take away and share with the community here in Ireland. Joy, would you like to have an idea? Okay, let's go with Kalpana first and we'll come back around.
I actually think two things. We don't have an open research unit in our big funder, Research Ireland. Other countries do. Like UK, for example, their funders actually have an open science office. That's one thing. The other thing that people are really crying out for is training. Our researchers are saying we don't understand how to work with this. The TTOs were saying the same thing. Our librarians, data stewards are like, well, they know about it, but they know less about the commercialization side. So really, it's finding ways to help facilitate those conversations through projects like NORF, through, not just reaching out to the same people that we all see, but to other communities as well.
Thank you. Aideen, we'll come back around.
I think the inter-institutional connectivity would really benefit from national organizations such as this. We have like SFI partnerships, but really those are very much tied to individual institutions. And most of our research institutes are also tied to an institution. To get data to really work, I think we need the kind of FinData or the Danish model, like the Health RI is another model in Netherlands, where there's an organization where it is their job to connect the data. It is their professional job to actually make this work, to understand where the gaps are in the system. And I think it will come down to then you have the central repository. We are not sending data to Cambridge, we are sending it to a central repository in Ireland that is secure and protected in Ireland, and it is there for our benefit. And setting that resource up with the data standards, it will actually unleash an incredible innovation, I think, in the country, because all of a sudden we will have access to, at the moment, data within a project is really it's involved. It's a LERO, it's an insight, it's a APC, it's within a particular research centre. We can get access to the publications, but really when we're talking about life science data, we actually want the genomics data. We want those really big data files. But we can't find them because they're in a hard drive someplace stored securely under a desk. There's way too many people nodding to that. So what if we actually had fair metadata? You know, more people nodding. Where we could actually search like what's in the National Biobank, what's in the National Data Repository, and have that, and then we actually have value. And then we can partake in these global studies, and we can benchmark Irish health and Irish life science against the best in the world. At the moment, we're funneling in our, you know, we're just looking at each other. We need to be having the national vision and the national strength and capacity, bringing and leveraging all of us for the best of us.
Thank you. Now, Latoro, do you want to give us some other advice based on your observations today?
I'm not one to give advice, but I'm not communist. A colleague says that all Latin Americans, we are communists. But I want to say, taking the example of her the lack of infrastructure, I think that you need to invest in infrastructure to put the data, the software, the literature open and available. Another thing is the multilingual thing. I think that there's a lot of content that is invisible because the language. That's another thing that we all need to invest on. The other thing is, we didn't say nothing about the licenses. It's not the same to have a non-commercial license, you publish openly, but with the commercial and non-commercial licenses. So take a look to that. So for me, it's, again, we need to have a plan. We need to have a plan to gradually move the investment from this to this transfer to the private sector, to open infrastructures, diamond journals, other ways to publish, other ways to make research assessment, move the incentives in the community for make this cultural change possible and valuable for the researchers also. So it's not an advice, it's what we are trying to do also.
Thank you, Latoro. Enjoy.
From what they've all said, what is very clear is that you do have the budget. You do have the budget, and that means you can really invest in open infrastructure. That was just one university. I do not know how much you're spending on APCs, literally in the wild, in the other universities. That was one university. So you do have the budget to redirect that money for open infrastructure. And as much as we are talking about open research being a foundation of an inclusive innovation system, we need to look at what we already have and how we can redirect that funding to invest in open infrastructure and have better inclusive systems that can support smaller institutions. Because I don't think all the universities have the same capacity to put 400,000 euros per year just on APCs. We need to, when we're embracing openness, we should shift from a model of knowledge consumption to one of knowledge co-creation, and that's what our colleague was talking about, especially when it comes to open education resources. And there's a power in co-creation because you end up learning. This is just now within Ireland. You learn so much from the smaller institutions because you'll find there are certain institutions that are leading in some of these conversations. So you end up learning quite a bit from that. And in the long run, we need to look at open research, not from a moral imperative, but an innovation strategy for sustainable development. Going back to the fact that sustainability can be managed by the fact that you do have a budget. It is possible. It is possible to achieve this. So you have more or less the same challenges like we do, not having a national repository. I'm actually surprised that your data and metadata is stored in another country. That needs to change, and it should be really like one of the priorities in terms of making sure that you have data stored at home, because really that was the essence of what we were trying to talk about, making sure that our data stays in the continent. So you do have systems in place. It's just saying how best you can redirect them to support your your innovation, what do you call it, your openness and making it as sustainable as possible.
Thank you, Joy. And I think we have to wrap now, or do we have time for? We have time for one question from the audience, and we have a very eager question coming up here. Please introduce yourself as well. Though.
And I'll make this brief, and I think that actually Joy may have kind of answered it. The 2024 Eurobarometer showed that 80% of EU citizens support the idea of open access to research results and data. However, 72% still remain very skeptical about who really benefits from this. So I suppose in all of this discussion, how do you balance public funding to generate the evidence that is then consumed by private entities? And so you're essentially privatizing the data at that point. How do you achieve that? But I like the idea of that kind of knowledge co-creation rather than knowledge consumption. But do you have other ideas other than rioting in the streets? Sorry, my name is Maura Heine.
So at least in life sciences, I can say that, you know, some of the biggest contributions is when everything has been made open. So within cancer, the Cancer Genome Atlas project was funded by the NIH in the US, and basically it provided molecular data, genomics and everything else on about 10,000 cancers. And that has spurred so much innovation globally. And then you have to ask, well, maybe the NIH in the US could say, well, actually, you know, I've met so many, like I've reviewed, I don't know how many theses in Ireland, and people are using the TCGA data, that's American data. It is spurring science in Ireland, in Africa, in countries all over the world. And then I suppose you have to think of what's the overall thing is we're trying to cure cancer. And cancer doesn't know borders. And yes, you know, we will all benefit even if that company is in Denmark, you know, because we will actually have access to medicines or new insights. So I think you actually have to think on a bigger level sometimes of who actually benefits. The second thing is leveling the playing field when we actually have fully open data as well as the publication, because the publication in a lot of our cases is just a summary of the results. That doesn't mean those results are reproducible. And reproducibility is a crisis. And so to have the reproducibility, we need data and we need the code. Now, you may have the data and the code might be described in the methods, but actually that doesn't mean it's reproducible. And so then you say, right, we go to the GitHub repositories. And there was a study that was done a couple of years ago where they looked at 30,000, no, it was more than 30,000 publications that had GitHub repositories with Python code that was open. So they tried to pull down those, and many of the code, they couldn't install it, it didn't work. So even if it is on GitHub, it's not installable. Of those 30,000 GitHubs, there was less than 1,000 where they could actually reproduce the work. So it speaks to open science is more than just a publication. It is incredibly important. Having access to the publication is incredibly important, but if we want to reproduce that science, we need the data, we need the methods, we need the code. And then it's not even having the code, it's having that code that is actually developed to a standard that makes it reusable. And that is an entire process, and that's very much like what Elixir is doing for life science data in Europe. It's creating that full pathway through. So how do we create the standards so that we're actually all benefiting? But I think there's enormous, you know, we can look to survival statistics, you know. Most people now survive breast cancer. You know, 20 years ago, people didn't. The pandemic, you know, there's so many things where we can look. I think we just look to mortality in each country in the world. We're surviving longer. You know, we no longer survive to 45, which was the average life expectancy for most of the time that humans have been on this planet. we're doing better.
We do hold the pandemic up as an example of open science. However, again, there was closure afterwards. They say, the vaccines and so forth. So let's not forget that. I mean, that it kind of went in the opposite direction. I remember writing a piece quite early on about how data sharing was going to be a collective action problem, and it did turn out to be just that. Except afterwards, we went back to business as usual and closure, and we saw parts of the world not having access to those vaccines.
Yeah. They've talked about health, I'll talk about agriculture. So in the case of the continent, the delicate balance comes, with my observation, the delicate balance comes from what the agenda of the continent is. And one of the agendas, that is Agenda 2063, is agriculture, so reducing farming. So what we've seen is that industry has a very strong interest in agriculture. So and also with climate change. So now the rise of climate smart agriculture. So what my observations are that industry is getting involved, but working closely with the government. There's a good side to it and there's a bad side to it. The good side is that we have industry supporting this research, and we have amalgamations of universities like the RUFORUM, which brings about 147 universities that are just focusing on agriculture in Africa, just to focus on climate smart agriculture, because they are helping the continent. But at the same time, the bad side to it is that, which we're becoming more cognizant about, is that even though industry is involved in supporting and funding this research, they're also involved in influencing policy that is not particularly helpful to indigenous systems on the continent. So it's a bit of a double-edged sword. And of course, open research has really spurred access to information, and the translation from researcher to farmer has made it much, much more easier. But then there is still a delicate balance on how industry is influencing policy to support them, but not necessarily support the farmers. So it's a bit of a double-edged sword. Yeah.
Well, thank you. Thank you to all our panelists. I think we have run out of time for today, but I want to say a huge thank you for everyone who participated here today, both from the floor and in particular our wonderful panelists for giving us this great, bright goal in terms of actual social impact of where innovation can bring us, and indeed the pathway there, collective action in whatever form it may take, and the infrastructure. But I hope that you enjoyed the panel session, and now I will hand it back to Michelle to take us to the close of the day. Thank you all very much.
Okay, so I promise you brief closing remarks, and I will keep these brief. Beforehand, there is some housekeeping, because there is always housekeeping. So can I just ask those of you who are not returning tomorrow, if you could please leave your lanyards at the check-in desk? That would be great, thank you. If you are joining us for the evening reception, make sure that you have collected your wristband at the reception desk as well. This is a festival after all, so we must have wristbands. And I think there are a few wristbands left as well, so if you are at a loose end for the next couple of hours, please do feel free to join us. So as we come to the end of the first day of the National Open Research Festival, I just want to take a few moments to thank those who made today possible, to reflect on what we've heard, and to look ahead to what's next for open research in Ireland. First, I want to extend sincere thanks to everyone who contributed to today's programme, to our speakers, our chairs, our panellists, and our workshop coordinators, many of whom travelled to be here. Thank you for your insights, your openness, and your generosity in sharing your expertise. A special thanks, I hope you'll all agree, is owed to Joy Owongo, who travelled from Kenya to attend the festival and to give her inspirational and motivational keynote address, and contributed so much to today's programme. If you just join me in thanking Joy once more, please. To the very patient members of our programme committee, so Ailish O'Carroll, Open Research Support Officer at NORF, Beth Kazook, Research Data Manager at DRI, Alexandra Della Palta, Director of RDA Europe, Edie Davis, Programme Officer of Research Policy at Research Ireland, Joan Murphy, Daria IE National Manager, Sinead Reardon, Head of International Relations and Policies at the Royal Irish Academy, Claire Dillon, co-founder of Open Ireland Network, and Jenny O'Neill, Research Engagement Officer at HEANet. Thank you for working so thoughtfully to shape today's agenda. Thank you to the Royal Irish Academy for once again hosting us in this truly beautiful venue, and thank you to my wonderful colleagues at the Digital Repository of Ireland. Thank you to the Department of Further and Higher Education, Research, Innovation and Science, and to the Higher Education Authority for funding the event and for your continued leadership. And finally, a word of appreciation for the volunteers and staff who have worked quietly behind the scenes, managing logistics, registration, microphones, timing, and putting out little fires I'm sure I'm not aware of. It is that invisible and meticulous work that events like this rely on, and I'm truly very grateful. So in that regard, I'd like to thank Ellie Cullen, who is hiding down the back of the room, NORF's Communications and Engagement Officer, who for the second year running stepped in at the 11th hour and transformed the programme into a vibrant and engaging event. And I'd also like to make special mention of Ailish O'Carroll, who unfortunately couldn't join us today as she's on maternity leave. Ailish has been an absolute pleasure to work with, and I wish her every happiness and joy in this new chapter of her life. So while we're closing today's formal sessions, the festival is not over. Day 2 will feature a series of community engagement workshops exploring the next phase of open research monitoring in Ireland, the future of open research and public engagement, open science and public-private partnerships, and aligning our national PID strategy with EOSC recommendations. Listening to today's discussion, several themes have emerged. First, the interconnectedness of global open science and the importance of visibility of research outputs. We explored the role of infrastructure and interoperability and heard of the shared commitment to ensure Ireland's systems are connected, sustainable and internationally aligned. Many of these conversations emphasised what we already know, that persistent identifiers are a foundational infrastructure to enable open science. We highlighted how open science is future-proofing our research and innovation ecosystem. We heard about the importance of moving from policy to practice and implementation. And many of the NORF-funded projects and affiliates not only discussed how they were indeed moving from policy to practice, but did just that via the Open Research 101 workshops. We discussed the central issue of research culture, how we recognise and reward open practices, and how we ensure that openness is inclusive, equitable, and embedded in how research is valued. Across all these discussions, we heard about the importance of community, supporting and conducting research for community, by community, and with community. So it has been almost 3 years since NORF launched the National Action Plan for Open Research, and during that time we've made significant progress in coordination, infrastructure and capacity building. We've built partnerships across government, higher education and civil society, and we've strengthened Ireland's voice in international conversations about openness and equity in research. As many of you will know, this is a moment of transition for NORF. The forum's activities at the Academy are drawing to a close at the end of this year, marking the completion of an important chapter in its development. And I want to take this opportunity to acknowledge the role of both the Royal Irish Academy and the Digital Repository of Ireland in hosting and supporting NORF, and to thank all of the colleagues here who have contributed so much to its success. While the next phase of NORF's work will take shape in a new context, the community and shared purpose that have grown around it will continue to thrive, and I hope that you are all greatly encouraged by William Bosang's remarks this morning, reaffirming the department's commitment to the open research agenda and highlighting the impacts of the NORF-funded projects to date. And to those NORF projects that will be ongoing throughout 2026, I want to assure you now that you have absolutely nothing to worry about, and we will discuss the administration of the funding in further detail tomorrow. The next phase of our work will ask us to look forward. The geopolitics, geoeconomics, and technology shaping research are evolving rapidly. Artificial intelligence, data governance, and new models of scholarly communication are shaping how we create and share knowledge. Our challenge is to ensure that Ireland not only keeps pace with these changes, but as a leading voice, guided by the values of openness, autonomy, collaboration, integrity, inclusivity, care and collegiality, and excellence. That leadership will depend on all of us and on a continued investment, not only in systems and infrastructures, but in people. To quote Joy's keynote, we need strong communities to amplify collective action. Communities are at the heart of this transformation. Open research requires open communities, and open communities require care, recognition, and resources. So, as I reflect not only on today, but on the last 3 years, what stands out most to me is this community. Open research in Ireland is thriving because of the people who are building it: researchers, librarians, data experts, technologists, funders and policymakers working together with a shared purpose. And I want to sincerely thank each of you for giving me the opportunity to work with you and for you over the last 3 years. So, as we close the first day of the National Open Research Festival, I want to congratulate each of you on all of your work to date and to encourage you to keep fighting the good fight. I hope to continue the conversation with some of you at this evening's reception and to come back tomorrow ready to roll up our sleeves and dive into the workshops. Together we are building on an open, inclusive and world-class research system for Ireland, one that benefits not just our research community, but the whole of society. Thank you all and enjoy the rest of your evening.